All right. Hi, Roula. Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Hi, Josh, and thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate it. As I was saying, I first came across your work in social media, and then I saw that, you do a lot of different things, but one of the things that really jumped out to me was that you write poetry. And I want to jump into your book, Simply Being. Before we do that, I actually just want to talk to you about poetry and kind of get your thoughts on a couple different things. So first of all, I want to share a quote that actually comes from your book, and it's towards the end of the book, I believe. But you say, "As I always tell my students, to write a poem is to take the world around you and recreate it according to how you perceive it. Not only to write about it as such, but also to experience your being through possibilities by taking the ordinary and rendering it extraordinary." And I think it's a beautiful line. I do a bit of writing myself, and that really kind of captures the way that I experience it. Is that you're viewing the world, but you view it through this filter of all these things that you've experienced, all these stories that you've heard, um, all these ideas that you've encountered and accepted. And so you really are returning it to the reader as how you perceive the world. But I just want to maybe just ask you a little bit about why poetry for yourself, what pulls you towards it, and then when you write poetry, what is it? What are you experiencing? What are you trying to share?
Right. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for this question and for the opportunity to talk about what poetry means to me and why I do it or how I do it. Well, first of all, I'm a huge believer in the universality of poetry and the huge archetypal energy that we find in it. It doesn't only touch the readers, but it also touches, and most of the time, it surprises the poet because there's a lot of discovery, there's a lot of possibility. And the poem, just like most artworks, it kind of has a life of its own. And it's a manifestation of so many archetypal energies within. Poet and Professor Sandra Faulkner, in her book on poetic inquiry, says that poetry in research is a way to tap into the universality of things and radical subjectivity. And I'm a total believer in this. There is so much tapping into different worlds, into universalities that we find in poems, but we don't really find in real life. I mean, you cannot tap into universalities by just thinking about things in normal, rational ways. You do need that other mode of thought. So, again, this is the cosmic nature of art, the cosmic nature of poetry. The archetypes in it, in poetry, are the essential movers actually behind all forms of creative endeavors. We find them in poems, we find them in so many other pieces of art, but they stem from us and they are the main movers of things. Personal psychology is also important, although it is not really necessary when looking at a poem or when writing it. It can be reflective of the archetypes at work, but again, because of the universal nature of archetypes, it's not really about the poet. Oftentimes, it's about the universalities that are inside the poet, and this is what helps us connect with each other, because the archetypes in me are probably in you and in so many other people, but they're manifested differently. So we don't really understand the poems as much as we feel them, and we grasp the energies, the archetypal energies in them. So I think this is quite special in poetry. Also, the fact that it uses words, but not in the usual sense, and not necessarily in verisimilitude. So it's more like abstract art most of the time. It has its own energy. It's not literal energy. It moves us from the literal modes of thinking into the poetic modes of thought. I also like that each poem has its own unique voice, just like the many different voices within the poet. As Virginia Woolf, I think it was Virginia Woolf that once said, we are not one and simple, but we are complex and many. So I do believe in this, and I believe that the poem can teach the poet how many different voices are within, and how to tackle those voices, how to give them some free rein through the poem itself. And of course, Jung, when we want to talk about poetry, although Jung did not really talk about poems per se and not extensively, but I do find the poetic process as something that depth psychology has a lot to say about. There's a lot of active imagination involved. And again, the archetypes, as we said, it's a channel for archetypal energies. And we can also, interestingly, we can approach a poem the way we would approach a dream. It is a poem is also a reflection of the psyche making its own visions. And both a poem and a dream can unfold and reveal the depths of the unconscious and make it conscious, because they will speak to us in images, which are, of course, visible things. No matter how conscious the act of writing a poem is, or seeing a dream or drawing it out can be, but these are all stemming from the depths of the unconscious. So we are actually doing what Jung told us to do, make the unconscious conscious, or else you will call it fate and it will control your life. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the things that are at the top of my mind right now about poems.
Okay, awesome. There's actually a lot of good stuff in there, and it really resonates with me. What you were saying about finding or using the images to bring to consciousness what is unconscious, it makes me think about, there's this Robert Frost quote where he talks about and I don't know the exact quote because it's just, I'm trying to say it off the top of my head, but he says, the feeling finds the image and the image finds the words. And there's like this process of you don't sit down necessarily having the words already in your head. And just even similar, I would say, to writing a story, you sit down and you may have this idea of the story in your head as like as scenes from a movie, moving one to the next, or chapters in a book. But then you sit down and you realize you actually have to put it into words, and it becomes a completely different experience, because the words, you can't just sit there and think one word at a time. You have to think in sentences and in stories. And so they just kind of you have to just let them flow through you. And I think that's that kind of flowing through you is help me understand it if I'm wrong, but it seems like that's what you're feeling the archetypes are doing through us as we create. They're almost, we're allowing them to take the reins or something and run with it. Right. Is that right?
Right, absolutely. And sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want to hear.
I was going to say, because poems or other creative processes as well, they're all the language of the psyche or the language of the soul. And it's a natural speech. So the image comes first and then the words can follow. And I think it was Michael Meade who said before, I think it was in an interview, he said that the soul doesn't speak like CNN. The soul or the psyche does not report things to us. There's a different means of storytelling or of image making or of poetry making. It's the human soul being given its space, the space for taking unlike things and putting them together, maybe. So, which is what we do in dreams. Dreams are so bizarre, they're so random. Sometimes you wonder how you got these 2 or 3 things together in the same dream. And poetry does the same, because again, this is the language of the psyche. And it's a very fascinating language to work with.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you mentioned dreams, because I think about dreams all the time. I actually, lately, I've started hosting a little dream workshop group. And the way you talk about images being the language of the psyche, and that's how dreams speak to us, is through all these random images that don't really seem, in the waking world, they would have nothing to do with each other. But in dreams, for some reason, they come to us paired together. Mm-hmm. I almost think about it, I often think about it from an evolutionary perspective, where if you go far enough back, our ancient ancestors, some version of us, we didn't even have words yet, but we were already communicating. We were communicating in the sense that we were interacting with the world around us, with the plants, the animals, the sky, the water. and with each other. And then only later did words come along, and they sped up communication and they made it a lot easier. But in a way, words can only be a representation of something else. And those images that come from our unconscious are so much older than those representations that we have today.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Uh-huh.
You mentioned archetypes, and archetypes is something that I think about a lot. And I see them appear in stories and dreams and all these different places. And Jung gave us his definitions and worked through it a lot. But archetype is still kind of a slippery, sometimes there's a difficulty in grasping the definition or what it actually is. And I'm curious for you, how do you explain it to yourself, or how do you explain it to those you speak about? How do you think about archetypes?
Well, I like to think of archetypes as inherited energies that are pre-verbal, even pre-image. So before the image, before the word, there is the archetype, which is it's kind of like the pre-existence or the non-empirical existence of things that we inherit and that we also share among each other. So as the human race, we all have those archetypes within us. We manifest them differently. We project them differently on each other, onto the world, but we have them. So they're pretty much the same. And again, this is what we learn from looking at different myths. There are creation myths and fertility myths in every culture around the world. Even today, if we, with the rise of the Zoom meetings and the Zoom literary events and stuff, when we share poems with each other, most of the time, and this is something that we especially saw at Indelible during the pandemic, we saw that we were all kind of trying to make sense of this confusing world around us. We were all confused and scared, trying to make sense of things, but we all did it differently. It felt the same, but the images that arose and the words that came out and the structures were very different. So that's also a hugely connective characteristic in poetry, and its ability to carry those archetypal energies, because a poem is actually carrying something that you share with somebody else that you've inherited as a human being, maybe for thousands of years. But it's different from person to person in its manifestation, but it's pretty much the same as an energy.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it, as these energies inherent in us. So again, going back to evolution, it seems like they're all coded within us, and given our time and place, they just manifest differently. Or thinking about it another way, given our time and place, and even as your own personal evolution as a human being, you go through these phases where different archetypes kind of take the realm, or not the realm, the reins to kind of navigate you through different aspects of your life. Which, when it comes to poetry, then it's interesting. I think if you write from the unconscious and you let these archetypes guide you, they take over in the moment. Perhaps that's why poetry sits so much in our feeling function, is because when one archetype speaks to the same archetype in somebody else, you can really feel the resonance of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Uh-huh.
Is this, so another word you threw out there was universalities. And
Right.
I think this is kind of in that same thread of, we all have these archetypes within us, but do you mind just taking a second to dive a little bit further into this idea of universalities?
Okay. Well, universalities can be in the form of feelings, for example, feelings like fear, feelings like happiness, love. Universalities could also be in the form of, let's say, concepts or essential concepts that we need in life, like the concept of the mother, the father, the sage. So, yeah, I mean, it's something that has been present in people for many, many years, ever since the beginning of time, ever since the first cave paintings. They manifest again differently but we can see the common thread, and that's why we find them to be universal. If you look at Shakespeare, for example, Shakespearean plays are considered very archetypal and very universal because you could easily reproduce a Shakespeare play today, and it will make perfect sense with the world around it. So they're timeless, they are needed, and they are found in everyone who is a human being from the beginning of time until now, and perhaps into the future as well. So again, these are the qualities that we feel and we do not necessarily have to understand. It's the irrational mode of thought, the more intuitive mode of understanding as well. And we find those in universalities.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like just the experience of being and all the things that come along with it. It's like from a physics perspective, it's like the qualia, where there's just all these, where you actually experience something, where you actually experience the color red. You actually experience what it's like for your mother to be upset with you. And at some level, everybody inherently understands these experiences because we all go through it. It also makes me think about stories and how we think in stories, we experience life in stories, and there's these big overarching stories. And even though they keep getting retold in different ways with different contexts and new characters, they're just the same story. It's almost as if this is, one of those things, being a human, where we're born with all these things encoded into us. And sometimes I think that we probably already have the stories encoded into us as well, where, they say there are no new stories, just the repeating of old stories, and it's new context, but it's an interesting idea.
Right. And we're all storytellers. This is a very unique human ability. It's not the ability to reason. It's not even the ability to talk, but it's the ability to tell stories. It's the mythos in us all.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, especially because given today, there's so many stories that we have put down that we've let go of. We still read the Greek myths, but we read them as if they're just interesting stories, or like almost like fairy tales now, where you can learn something from them, but they're just stories.
Yes, sir.
But at the same time, we have all these stories that we live today, that we believe today, and it's as if we're not aware that they're stories. It's as if we're trapped in them. Yeah. One question I like to ask people is, given this idea that like myth just continues on, we've let go, we look at some old myth as if it's just a story, but we exist in a myth today. When you look around in the world, what is the primary myth that you think what's the primary myth that jumps out to you, that you see us living, and you see the majority of people pretty unaware that this is a myth? Is there one that stands out to you?
Well, myth in the sense of mythos, right? Not in the sense of the everyday sense of the word here that is commonly used to refer to something that is not real, right?
That's right. Yeah. The myth being like the story that you live by, even though you're not aware that it's a story that you're living by. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for me, and for such a long time, actually, it's always been the death and rebirth myth. I think that's the most important one. And I think this is something that we all live by. Not necessarily in the literal sense, but if you look at the human body, for example, our cells die and are replaced every few years. So maybe every 7 years or so, we do not have a single cell that is pretty much the same as it was before. We change with time. We usually check out differently than the person we checked in as into this world. So change is a huge part of life. And in order for change to occur, there needs to be a death and a rebirth, multiple deaths and rebirths, actually. The death and rebirth of notions that we believe in, of who we are, of the skills that we learn, places that we live in. So there is constant change in the world around us. Hope is also a form of resurrection, and it is also it also belongs into the whole category of the death and rebirth myth. So yeah, I find life is all about death and death is all about life, and it's the dance between the two that we are constantly living with, in a benign sense, of course. So
Yeah,
I don't mean it
yeah.
literally.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you, I mean, first of all, I think it's a great myth to point out. It's one of those things that I've experienced. I grew up in a very religious household and have since, let that part of myself pass away, and then had to be reborn in a sense by coming into a new way of being. So I really do resonate with that. And I think it's interesting that you pointed out, because there's such a strong, I don't know, there's such a strong part of society that doesn't want to go through that. At the same time,
Right.
it's inevitable. It's inevitable in individuals and
Mhm.
partnerships and families. The other thing that you point out is literalism. You said that, when you first introduced this idea of death and rebirth, you said, well, not literally, but, you're talking psychologically or mystically or some other form, spiritually
Mhm.
even. Um, and it's interesting. It's interesting to me how we literalize stories, how we literalize the mythos. And then once we literalize it, it becomes something to be feared. And so if you're genuinely
Yes.
talking about life or death, Now, did you have something to
Mhm.
say?
Because when you give something a literal meaning, you are kind of tying it into a fixed time, a fixed meaning. Um, Whereas if you take things in the metaphorical sense, or if you look at things as symbols, you are more open to, I mean, as Susan Rowland says, the language of symbols is a language that is very open to hosting the unconscious, hosting possibilities. A symbol can mean many things. Whereas if you, and this is actually a resurrection, you know, because nothing really dies with a symbol. Whereas if you give something a certain meaning and you fix it to it, yeah, this is a kind of stuckness. It is a kind of death that, you don't really get out of. And again, this is a way we should avoid when we're approaching the arts or the creative psyche in general. So yeah, I mean, what means something to me today might mean something else tomorrow. Um, what I feel so tied up with today might be something I'm freed from in the next few years, let's say. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's all about not being stuck. And there is a kind of stuckness in literalism.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you mean by what do you mean when you say that it's something we should avoid in creativity in the arts, this literalism? How does somebody go about avoiding literalism in their creative ventures?
Yeah, I mean, for example, many people stay away from poetry because they think it is too difficult to understand. So the first thing to do here to avoid literalism is to stop trying to understand it. You could very easily listen to a poem in a completely different language and feel it without understanding what it means, but it can make you cry. It can make you laugh. I don't know, it can make you feel all kinds of stuff. So that's one way. For example, when you're approaching a poem, do not try to understand it. Abstract art, for example, is another way of approaching creativity in a non literal sense. So if you look at a Pollock or a Kandinsky and you try to understand what's going on in there, then you're going to end up a lot more confused than you were before you looked at the painting. And you will not be able to grasp what it is trying to tell you as a painting or what it might mean to you at a specific point in time when you were looking at it. You might look at the same painting 10 years from now and then see it differently or feel different things about it.
Okay,
So
yeah,
again, you're letting the symbols do the work.
that makes a lot of sense. In fact, when you talk about, so there's two aspects to it then. There's like the creating of the art, and then there's also the viewing of the art or consuming of the art. And
Right.
it's really interesting the way that our world has transitioned towards more abstract things. And
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Campbell in his Masks of God series, he points out that transition has something to do with the shift from a literal view of the story to letting the story go, and then Because if
Right.
we look back in time, you know, during the height of the Roman Empire, for example, just the art that they produced was not only amazing and fantastic and beautiful, but it was very realistic. Even it was literal.
Right. Right.
And then same with the early Christian, you know, as the Christian church grew, the Catholic church grew, it was a lot of literal interpretations of the stories. And so you had images depicting scenes, and it was just very, very realistic. And then moving into that abstract world is kind of like letting go of that literalism. It's letting go of thinking of things
Right.
as very specifically true or not true.
Mhm.
But it's fascinating.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, there are some forms of early religious arts that focus a lot on symbols, even in Christianity. For example, I grew up in a Greek Orthodox family, and Greek Orthodox icons are quite different than Catholic art in a sense that it has to be very highly symbolic. And the word icon in itself it means symbol. So, and also if you look at ancient Egyptian art, it is literal sometimes, but you also have symbols like the ankh and the gods as well. So they're very symbolically represented. You have, for example, Bastet with a cow's head, and other gods and goddesses that are represented as half animals and half humans. So it's interesting. I mean, if we do look at that, the more older the art is, it's very symbolic. And then there was a certain point in time, as you just suggested, it became very literal. There was a lot of verisimilitude in painting, religious art, and other types of art as well. And that kind of changed in modernism, where people started turning more towards what's abstract and the meaning behind representation.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole topic kind of wants it makes me want to jump into your writing, and we could talk a little bit about your approach, and also just I think symbols is going to come up here as well. Um, but you wrote a book of poetry, and this was actually done kind of during lockdown, during the pandemic, to kind of
Yes.
frame kind of the mindset of where you were. We were all in a different place back then. Um, it was like a new experience. It was like something none of us had ever expected, and it just kind of changed everybody's view about almost about everything. And I remember, this is just kind of an aside to about the pandemic, but or that period of time, is I have two young kids, and during the lockdowns and like school closures and everybody's masking and all this, I remember my kids asking me, they were like, "Well, Dad, tell us about your first pandemic. Like, what was it like the first time you had a pandemic?" And so in their children, you know, so in their mindset, this is just something that happens, and you know, you have to figure it out.
Right.
But from my perspective, I was like, this is the world's topsy turvy, and it's never been like this before. So yeah, you were in that state, and you're writing this book. And just really quickly, the title of the book is Simply Being. And just from the kind of the intro or the write up, it says Simply Being is a celebration of the various facets of life, its blessings, beauties, and challenges. Um, so talk to me about like the mindset you were in that space. What was it like? What was the situation? And
Oh,
what were those archetypes that were coming up that were saying, "Hey, we need to say something here"?
oh, there was so much going on. I mean, I'm sure you know,
Yeah.
because this was this was a shock to all of us, and it's like our lives suddenly changed, and we've become prisoners of God knows what, and we don't know what's really on out there, but we know it's really dangerous. We don't know if the vaccine is going to come out, if it's safe, if it's not, and it looked so surreal, and it felt so surreal. And because I'm a modernist and I'm always reading modernist stuff, looking at modernist art, and influenced by so many modernist notions of seeing the world and regarding it, it did remind me of the modernist period as well, because there was also another pandemic, the flu. Um, and I would wonder, what would Ezra Pound do? What would T.S. Eliot do? What would all those folks do? And I found myself resorting to the same belief that most modernists had, that the world must be created out of the way we see it and we perceive it. Um, and that was very difficult to do, but we had to do that, or else I would have lost my sanity. We were trapped in an apartment. That's when I was living in Dubai back then, and it was a very high-rise apartment. So you miss the ground. You're up there all the time for almost 6 months. Um, we did not have a balcony because obviously it's a very tall tower and we cannot open windows because it's dangerous. I mean balconies, but we had a window which was an awning window. You would just push it a little, and that's it. So that was the only dose of fresh air that we would get every day. You miss the sun, you miss the ground, you miss Mother Earth, you miss nature and everything else. So I found myself reflecting on memories of being in nature. And then I lost my grandmother early on during lockdown. My grandmother lived a wonderful life. She passed away at the age of 102. So she had also seen pandemics and stuff like that, and world wars. And so she had been through a lot as well. And I thought, you know what, I could see it as a conversation with my grandmother. I could see it as a conversation with nature. I saw it a conversation of all what meant so much to me. And I couldn't have any more, or I couldn't see until a very long time. For example, I didn't know when we were allowed to leave the apartment and just go downstairs at least and walk somewhere on the street. So yeah, it was a strange setting. So many things were changing. We did not know how the world would be like when we went back out. And there was a lot of cabin fever, of course. We felt incarcerated. We felt helpless. And the idea of writing the book was also to kind of write my way out of lockdown and see the world as something beautiful, see the world that I want to be in. Whether it was in the form of memories or in the form of reflecting on what's happening right now, being a little optimistic about it. So I was trying all that, and I found that poetry really helped, especially that I was also keeping a dream journal. And again, making use of those dream images that were popping up. And by the way, if you don't keep a dream journal, you don't remember anything. So I had to have the journal next to me. Otherwise, I would just forget my dreams and, just go about the day without remembering anything. So yeah, I've always written poetry, but during lockdown specifically, that was the time when I found myself rigorously making something out of this experience and reflecting so much during the confinement that we were all in. My relationship with poetry also changed somehow. It was sort of like a portal into the world. At a time when I was physically bound in a very tiny space with my family. And yeah, as I said, I missed nature, I missed friends, I missed so many people that I loved and that I couldn't be with. So poetry was a way kind of out into the world that I loved, the world that I wanted to walk into after all that was over. And it helped. I was happy when I wrote poems.
Yeah, that sounds like being happy when you write poems. It sounds like being an artist. You feel good when you're singing. You feel good when you're creating. It all harkens, like the way that you talk about creating your world out of how you perceive it. It's an interesting approach to the situation because you're in this situation you can't control. The world is shifting. There are these competing forces, and it's affecting everybody in their personal lives. We were also, my wife and we have 2 kids. We were also in a small apartment during most of that, and yeah, it was. And schools were closed down, so the kids were at home all day. We were working from home. It was just challenging. But the way that you talk about needing to, it was almost as if you had this impulse to write because you needed to see if the world is how you perceive it, then you needed to see how you needed to like figure out how you perceived it. It harkens back to like this
Yes,
quote,
sir.
it's your quote that I read earlier. A poem is to take the world around you and recreate it according to how you perceive it. It's a beautiful idea. And
Yes, sir.
in fact, I think that it's the kind of idea that it really can help through difficult times, even like the smallest of difficult times. An example being from my own life is we have a cat in our house, and this cat is great sometimes, and other times it's just absolutely terrible. And one of the things that I experience with this cat is just I want to sleep through the night and I want to have a good rest. And then, it's 2:00 in the morning and the cat's pushing things off the dresser, or the cat is jumping up and, grabbing your feet. And so I just want to, there's the immediate animal reaction inside of me is to get angry, to impose my will on the situation. But then this very thought that you mentioned about creating your reality based on how you perceive it, to just sit there and look at this situation and go, oh, this is something that is supposed to happen for me, or this is something that I am manifesting myself. And because of that,
Yes.
I'm supposed to handle it in such a way that I learn and grow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's just that's how I take what you're
it's
saying.
Yeah, that is so right. And it's also, it's like, I don't want to be here. I want to be somewhere else, and I might as well create this place I want to be at this moment. My daughter was doing the same thing. She was 7 at the time, and she was writing stories about kids playing outside, about school, about so many things. And she was illustrating those books and using the stapler to bind them. And she'd tell me, hey, look, Mom, I've published a new book today. Published, she'd actually use that word. She was also building houses from Lego bricks. So I think we were all kind of in this mode that, yes, we do want to create our space, our reality. And we want to learn from where we are right now. And we want to learn from this urge to create and this urge to be in a perhaps less scary world, or a place where we feel more at ease with our surroundings. We were very scared. So
yeah, well, yeah. And it changed the way that we all think about the world. I want to jump into the actual book, because it's broken down into kind of 4 sections, and we don't need to dive, we don't need to reveal the entire book, but I'm just curious about some of these higher topics. The 4 of them being ekphrasis. Did I pronounce that right? Ekphrasis.
Yeah.
Love, mythos, and then the world. And so I just wanted you to take me through each one of these one at a time. We'll go through them, and I just want to get your thoughts on them. It's now that it's been a little while. It's been, what, 2 years since you wrote the book?
It's been, yes, almost 3 actually. So
okay,
2.5 years, 3 years. Yeah. So the next one should be out soon as well.
Oh, okay. That's exciting.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, ekphrasis it's very special, because to me, interacting verbally with a pre-verbal sense of perception, which is the visual, the images, the paintings, the photos, all that, it's always a very fertile space where so many ideas emerge. And you learn so much just by interacting with an image, whether it's an inner image, like a dream image, or like the images that arise during active imagination, or whether you are trying to see what's inside a painting. And the more abstract it is, the better, because you are kind of creating a life, or adding an extra dimension to the painting that is in front of you without understanding it literally. But you're seeing stuff that's going on in the painting that you might see differently the next time you look at it. But anyway, it tells us a lot. So this response to images, or ekphrasis, or the transmediality of art, is something that I really enjoy. And we love it also at the LABRC. So we do give some um, eh, workshops and courses using ekphrasis to write poetry. So I did look at some paintings by my friends, other paintings like Van Gogh's painting, Starry Night. What else did I look at? Claude Monet. So yeah, so many of those paintings that I saw with a fresh pair of eyes. That's not really about the painting, but it's more about what the painting is saying to me at that moment when I was conversing with it. So that's ekphrasis. And then there's love, which is the different forms of love. So you find a lot of love, maternal love. So love for my daughter, love for my parents, love for my husband, the love for the creative process as well. So I think there was a poem in it called A Poet in Love or something like that. So it's about the creative process. And that one was, it's kind of influenced by James Joyce's idea from Finnegan's Wake that the poet or the writer is like a squid. The ink comes from within. And I sat a bit with this idea and wrote this poem. Mythos. Well, mythos is, again, there's a lot about the resurrection myth.
Let me stop you right. Let me stop you right there because there's so much in these first two. I don't want to get too far ahead, and then we'll circle back around to mythos.
All right.
The first thought I have is just you mentioning James Joyce, and just it's like you deserve a congratulations just for you've completed these books or you've read them and you've at some level you've understood them because if you want to talk about like just active imagination or like a constant stream of images, that's how James Joyce wrote, and it's pretty challenging. But going back to this idea of ekphrasis or just looking at images and letting it kind of flow through you, there's this idea that I've held on to for a long time, or I heard once, and it was really interesting to me, and I come back to it every now and then. But what you're essentially saying is that you're looking at other people's creations. So they created it at some time and some place with some thing flowing through them, and then you take it and you're saying, I'm not trying to look at it literally or even for what it necessarily is, but it's giving you all these new ideas and these new forms are appearing for you. And it's like this thing that this idea that I like is, as an artist, as a creator, you create something because it's of whatever it bubbles up inside of you. But once you put it out into the world, it no longer belongs to you, because now it belongs to whoever is experiencing that creation in that place and time. And
yes.
Yeah. And I mean, have you experienced that I'm sure that when you wrote this, you had certain thoughts and feelings. And then when people come back to you with what they've experienced, have you experienced that as well, that it moves people in ways that are unexpected?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because once it's out into the world, it becomes a symbol on its own. The painter or the writer's intention is no longer relevant. If we want to use Jungian alchemical terms, we would call it the third thing between the artist and the artist's creative process. So it's like 1 + 1 = 3. And the third thing is actually the work of art itself, the painting. So yeah, it has its own existence. It has a life of its own, and it speaks to us differently. So yeah, this is the way I would approach any painting, actually. I mean, sometimes, yes, I do admit that I sometimes think, what was this painter trying to say? Are there any specific hidden codes and symbols in the painting that he or she wants us to look at? So, but then again, you come to realize that if you look at the painting as the painting, not as somebody's creation, but as the creation, it speaks to you in a completely different language, and it opens up so many different doors as well.
Yeah, that's so similar to dreams, reading a dream or trying to interpret a dream, because you have to when I think about dream interpretation, I don't even know if I like the word interpretation, but just like dream work. Uh, the first thing you have to realize is that the dream itself is the container of the dream. And so,
Right.
in that same way that you're saying 1+1 =2, it works the same way with dreams, because you have, in our waking life, we're the subject and we act upon objects. But when you enter a dream, you suddenly
Yes.
become both the subject and the object. And that third piece is
Uh-huh.
you're also the observer, which is it's just fascinating. But yeah, I like that way of thinking about, I don't know, just the way of viewing and interpreting it. It's pretty fascinating.
It's
Moving
like
on.
what Henry
Oh, yeah.
David,
Go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead. I think
I
there's
was just going to quote
a little bit of a
Henry
lag,
David
so go ahead.
Thoreau. Okay. So Henry David Thoreau says something like, "It's not what you look at, but it's what you see." And again, ekphrasis is practically, it is this opportunity. It's the opportunity to see things without really paying attention to what you're looking at. So there's a painting, but you're not just looking at it, you're seeing things in it. And there's a huge difference between the two. You're not interpreting, you are listening. You become the observer, but at the same time, you also become a very receptive container to whatever the painting is trying to tell you.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that's beautiful. Okay, so I stopped you at mythos, so I want to give you a chance to jump back in there with mythos and then also the one following, world.
Okay, so with mythos, it is again the main myth that you see repeated in almost every poem in that section is the resurrection myth. And again, it's probably because of what was going on in the world. And I was not referring to people dying only, but I was also referring to the new world that we would be stepping into after all that was over. Um, there wasn't really a feeling of the end of things, uh, rather than a feeling that we're on the brink of something very new. Something has to end. A lot of things have ended. For example, our relationship with technology has ended. The way we look at viruses has completely changed. So many of us came out germophobes after the whole pandemic ended. We use Zoom a lot more. I never used it before, for example. Uh, so there was a lot of newness happening there. Um, I also looked at the resurrection myth for hope because we needed hope in order to cope with all the insanity that was going on around us. But yeah, I mean, you see that a lot, and I've used the image of Adonis in the poem Coquelicot. Coquelicot meaning the poppy flower, and it is the flower of Adonis. And yeah, I mean, almost all the other poems. So there's a lot of resurrection, a lot of images of Jesus as well, images of can't remember the other gods and goddesses but it was all about this. It's all about coming out clean. There's also the cocooning image as well. So the image of the butterfly coming out of the cocoon.
Yeah, so this earlier when I asked you about myth and which one stands out to you, you said the death and rebirth or resurrection myth.
Yeah.
And so it seems like this one really has sat with you and been something that's important to
Yeah.
you. It seems like.
Hmm.
Do you mind if I ask
And it
you
was also when I lost my grandmother as well. So
Right, yeah.
I was also reflecting on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and I'm sorry to hear about your grandma in that situation. There's a lot there for you. Do you mind if I ask you about your Greek Orthodox upbringing and how that affected
Yeah.
your understanding of myth? And then also just, maybe just for context, do you mind if I ask you what your relationship is with church or religion today?
Well, church is different than religion. Religion is different than spirituality, and they are not one and the same. Um, And there's a lot of ekphrasis actually in my relationship with the Greek Orthodox culture, if you want to call it that. I love icons. I am a huge fan. Everybody knows how obsessed almost I am with an icon and with what it can say. There are also two poems in that collection about icons, one called Iconic Existence and another one called The Icon Speaks. So it's also about what the highly symbolic iconography can tell us about ourselves at a specific moment, or, also through a universal language, which is the language of symbols. The colors, if you notice, they are not very bright. So unlike other Christian art, the colors are a bit more dim. They are a bit more solemn, and there's a lot of gold. So the end plate is always a gold plate. And I see that also as a metaphor for alchemy. So transformation, the transformation from the mundane into the extraordinary, or the transformation from the earthly to the spiritual, or the marriage between the two. In fact, we just came back from Bulgaria. We had, my daughter had a small, short school vacation, and we went there. And yeah, it was almost 5 days of nothing but icons and frescoes and so much art going on in there. So yeah, that's my relationship. I mean, that's the main bond, actually. So the art, you've got the icons, and you've also got the a cappella hymns, the chanting without the musical instruments. And I love that because there's so much focus on the human voice and on the collective human voice as well. So there's a lot of background music, but that is not made from musical instruments. It is just from the human voice. So that is the Byzantine chorus. And yeah, I mean, just like any religion in the world, there are the universals, the universalities that we spoke about. There are the archetypes, the archetypal movements. The core teachings are pretty much the same. When my daughter read Greek myth for the very first time, and there was a description of Zeus, she looked at me and said, "Isn't that like God?" So it's pretty much, there's so much that is the same. The essence is found everywhere. It's just that the representation, the manifestation differs. And that's the beautiful thing about having different religions, is that they all express the same things, the same universalities differently.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's also a lot of nostalgia, when you remember your childhood, your grandparents, and, your first religious experiences. So again, that also draws me towards iconography as well.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. In fact, so I grew up in a religion that was very literal, and in a family that was like very, very stern about it. And so having left my religion intentionally, I went through this kind of Nietzschean nihilism where you see the structure of it all, and you just cringe at it.
Yeah.
But then, but I've been on this journey long enough that I've come around pretty full circle to where I see almost all religion, they're based on stories, right? They're based on myth. And at the heart of all of these stories, at the heart of all of these rituals and practices, there's something of value that you can take from it, as long as you don't hold it in too literal of a sense, right?
Right. Yes.
Like you talk about, you mention alchemy a lot, and alchemy is something I've only come across it on the periphery, just through the reading Carl Jung, reading Joseph Campbell, reading, people who have spent much more time in it. But there's something beautiful about alchemy where it's so simple to see that if you take it literally, it's almost complete nonsense. But if you read it psychologically,
yes,
if you read it mystically, you see that, oh man, this is a beautiful metaphor. And the way I've learned to have a relationship with different icons and symbols, religious stories, is to see that value there, even if somebody else is going to take it literally and it's not going to be as moving for them. I can view it in a way that's beneficial, I could say. In fact, I think that all of them, at the heart of all of the creation of all of these myths, I don't necessarily think that people create the myths, but they flow through people, like we were talking about earlier. Because
Right.
at the heart of all
Yes.
of it, is somebody who had an artistic or creative mind.
And it's very important what you're saying, Josh, because all religions, any religion can turn literal at any time. It depends on the way you approach it. And that's why I said earlier on that religion is not necessarily spirituality, and the art or religious art is not necessarily, it has a life of its own. It teaches you in its own way, and it is not the literal way. It is the artistic way, the non-rational, comprehensive, understanding way. So it is this interaction with the art. It does not indoctrinate things to you. It does not tell you what to do. On the contrary, it kind of encourages you to look for meaning, to search for meaning. And I'm not saying that religion doesn't do that. It does, and it should. But what I'm saying is the art helps us not fall into the trap of literalism, because we really cannot understand art literally. We cannot understand it. We feel it, we grasp it at a very different level. So all religions, I believe, are the same in this sense, because all religions have art, all religions have rituals. And again, they could either be taken literally or not. So it depends on how you respond to it and to what it gives you. But it's a whole wealth of art and spirituality.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I think that's spot on. We're getting pretty close to being up on an hour, so I want to give you a chance to just cover this last section where
Okay.
you talk about world, and we've talked a little bit about the pandemic, but you also kind of go into this idea of becoming unmasked in an era of wearing masks, and then also you talk a little bit about the trickster. So I'm just throwing out the last few things, and I just want to see what you have to say about it.
Well, it's interesting because this coming weekend we have a conference called Modernism Remodeled, and this is the second Modernism Remodeled. The first one was exactly a year ago. And why was it called Modernism Remodeled? Because this is exactly how we can see today. It's not very different than modernism. We already had the pandemic, check. We are already living through what is not called a world war, but technically is one. And there's a lot of psychic shifts going around as well. So we are looking at things differently. We are questioning things. We are just, there's a lot of art making as well in order to try to understand what is going on. So it is a strange yet familiar global setting. It's strange because in our time, this was the first time we go through a pandemic and everything else, the whole series of things that ensued afterwards. But it's also familiar because we saw that in history books, in literature, in art that was from the modernist age. So yeah, we still maintain this modernist attitude here. We see poets and artists having a visionary tone. So the visionary tone is back. We are looking at new normals. We are wondering what's going to happen to humanity, to, how history will write about us. There's still a reaction to materialism, consumerism, wars, the over-industrialized world, global warming, economic problems. So we're still worried about the same things, and we're still reacting to it. And we're still trying to understand why this is happening. So this will naturally result in a creation of new forms of art, new forms of writing. And if we look at these new forms, they are actually evolved forms from the ones that we had 100 years ago. So that's why modernists are being read and reread nowadays. And if you look at today's art, starting from 2020, when the whole pandemic began, various expressions of people's personal experiences from around the world, they kind of rekindle these modernist images. And there's a lot of talk on connection, building bridges. So there are a lot of literary societies or communities, if you want to call them, that are emerging just like what happened 100 years ago. But this time they're happening through Zoom. So modernism is being remodeled. It's the same, but it's taking different shapes and forms. Lots of people are talking about apocalyptic vibes ever since 2020. And again, there was a little bit of that in Simply Being. So masks and unmasking, and that's because there was a lot of mistrust. Like, we did not know. Lots of people were talking about the virus being man-made. Other people were talking about whether or not to wear a mask, whether or not to take a vaccine. Is this all one big hoax? What is actually going on? So there was so much mistrust. And again, this was an unmasking of a kind, although everybody was wearing a mask, but there was an unmasking of so many different lies and conspiracies and so on. Although I got vaccinated and I wore the mask and I did all my homework very well, but still, it was a very confusing time for me and for others. So yeah, I mean, wars, revolutions, environmental issues, lots of new poets have emerged. So we might call them the pandemic poets if you want, or the new modernist poets. I don't know. It's just that, yeah, that's the whole unmasking issue of today, which is a remodeling of modernism, a remodeling of this healthy/unhealthy relationship with authority, with, again, some people were becoming increasingly spiritual while others lost any sense of spirituality that they had, resorting to art, making more art. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question, but that
yeah,
was the mode I was in when I wrote those poems.
Yeah, it's a good synopsis. I think that the world is such that, coming out of the 20th century, and it's almost as if we thought we had figured everything out, and
No.
this whole new wave of things, the pandemic, the wars that are going on. Like you said, I agree. I think we're already in this proxy third world war kind of thing going on. And there's just so many messages going about all of it, that trust is down at historical rates. But I think it seems like the message is that we're still humans and we still have a lot to figure out.
Yes.
And it's going to be, as much as we want political leaders to lead us into the future, as much as we want the economy to lead us into the future, whatever it may be, it really seems like the artists and the creators and the writers are going to be the ones that guide us into the future of tomorrow.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And because of this disillusionment, which was symbolized by the unmasking, this is precisely why there are more artists and there's a lot more art being created nowadays. It's a world that is strange and scary. And again, if you look at George Orwell's 1984, it is a very creepy setting nowadays. And yeah, people are just trying to create the new world out of creativity. I don't know if that makes sense, but this is what we all feel as writers, as poets, as artists. We feel that we need to create this way out, draw it, write it.
Yeah, the whole collective is going through these challenges, and it seems to me like the artists are the mechanism for the collective to figure something out, create a new idea of what we are, a new morality or something. All of this, I think, ties into, and I mean, like I said, these conversations go by so fast, and there was a lot more that I wanted to cover. But one of the things I want to give you a chance to talk about really quickly is Indelible, and what it is and what the goal is, and if somebody was to want to participate or get involved or even just consume some of the content, what is Indelible and how do they go about doing all that?
Well, Indelible is the literary journal that started it all. It was born in 2019. It's an online journal. However, the next issue will most probably be in print for the very first time. And it's a wonderful community. I do not just see it as a journal, but also as a wonderful community of creatives from around the world. So there are photographers, there are visual artists, and there are poets and fiction, nonfiction writers that like to contribute to it. It comes out twice a year. The next one should be out in May. We have just closed our submissions, a window, but we will be looking at the lovely works very soon, and hopefully we'll get it all out in May. We also have Indelible Evenings, which is a free online series. It's a literary series, an art series, so it depends on who our special guests are. Sometimes it's in the form of panel discussions. We get 2 or 3 artists that have a conversation about a specific theme. For example, we had one on ekphrasis. Sometimes we have a single author talking about his or her own work. Sometimes we have a poet that is, again, reading from their new books or their new works or something old. But it's mainly literary/artistic events, interviews with creatives, sometimes open mic nights, and it's completely free. We have at least one every month. We also have Psychreative, which is in parallel with Indelible Evenings. Psychreative has a more Jungian twist. So it's divided into 2. The session is 2 hours long. In the first hour, we have a guest speaker every time. And it's also completely free and online. And we have the recordings up on our YouTube channels. So the guest speaker will talk about a Jungian theme that is related to creativity. So it could be about the function of beauty. It could be about the function of dreams. It could be about painting. Could be about writing poems, but through a Jungian lens. And in the second half, we have members of the audience who would like to share their work. So whether it's music, whether it's a painting, whether it's a poem, everybody is welcome to share their work. So each person has around 5 minutes in order to showcase. And this also happens once every month. We have one coming up on the 27th, and it's featuring Dr. Lorna McClure, who will be sharing her video on urbanism and on how Manhattan came to be, and she will be talking about it from a depth psychology perspective. And then in the second half, we'll kind of open the mic and ask people to share their work if they like to.
Okay,
so these
awesome.
are both 2 signs.
Okay. And what's the website, or where can people find it?
Right. So indeliblelit.com. This is where Indelible is. And both Indelible Evenings and Psychreative are on our LABRC website, which is the London Art Space Research Centre. So it's labrc.co.uk. And there are also lots of workshops there, courses, and we also organize a lot of conferences. So whoever would like to see, and almost 40% of the things we do are free. Others are, with a small fee just to cover the costs of the activities. But we would like everybody to join, and we want it to be accessible to everyone who can make it.
Okay, awesome. Well, I've really appreciated this conversation. There's just one quote that I want to leave you with, and I think it actually speaks to what you're doing. This is from Joseph Campbell in his Massive God series. And he says, "For it is simply a fact that poets and artists who are dealing every day of their lives with the feeling as well as thought values of their own imageries of communication are endowed with a developed organ for the understanding of myth that is too often lacking in the merely learned, so that when the artist or poet is also learned, he may be or she may be a more dependable guide to the nuclear themes of a given mythic complex, and a much more profound interpreter of their relevance to life than even the most respected of its specialized academic elucidators." So in short, I think that
Beautiful.
what you're doing, it's clear that you see the mythic images and the power that they have, and you have an ability to, I don't know, I think you have an ability to share them and translate them into words that people can consume. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much, Josh. This was a wonderful conversation. We were all over the place, and you got me thinking about so many things that I love. And really, it was a conversation I greatly enjoyed. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for hosting me. It was a great honor.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And when your next book comes out, you'll have to let me know and we'll have to do it again.
Of course. Hopefully,
Okay.
I'll have my Twitter account back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you and bye.